Good evening, everyone. It's really a great honor to be here today in the city of Bergen on my very first visit, and with this wonderful opportunity to get to meet alumni of the Fulbright program and to have a very important discussion. We really appreciate having such fantastic speakers here tonight, and our audience and the audience that's tuned in online. My name is Sharon Hudson-Dean. I am the Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy, meaning that I'm acting in the capacity right now as the senior U.S. representative while we wait for an ambassadorial nomination. I'm very excited to be doing this important job at this critical time in global affairs and in the U.S.-Norway relationship. I've been a U.S. diplomat for 28 years. This is the 9th country that I've worked in, and it really was a place that I very much wanted to come to, in large part because the US and Norway are such incredibly close allies, partners, and friends, and we share a lot in common in terms of our values, but also in terms of what we are seeking for the world in global affairs, our concerns about some of the challenges right now, and talking about how to get through them and make this place a better world. Along those lines, we're having an important discussion tonight about disinformation and misinformation. I'll just say a few quick words about the Fulbright program. It was founded in 1946, in large part because the great Senator Fulbright believed that if our peoples went to other countries and their scholars and students came to our countries and we studied together and we got to know each other, that would promote peace and better understanding. It is the flagship U.S. exchange program. We are exceptionally proud of this program. It has produced a tremendous number of senior-level scholars and very impressive public policy makers, as well as activists and academics and even business people who all contribute to making this place a better world. We have had 44 Nobel Prize winners who were Fulbright alumni, including 3 Peace Prize winners. And it's wonderful that the Nobel Peace Prize this year directly connects into our topic tonight. The winners this year are 2 incredibly courageous journalists who have pursued the truth and freedom of expression in the face of grave threats to their security and actual killings of some of their journalists. We have great respect for these 2 individuals, and one of them is a Fulbright alumna, and that is Maria Ressa of the Philippines. She's a very proud alumna, and we are thrilled to see her get this important honor, but also her ability, as well as Dmitry Muratov, to discuss the importance of journalism and the truth. On the topic of disinformation and misinformation, it's something that all countries right now are wrestling with, or I would say should be wrestling with. It has become very widespread. Just a quick word to define: disinformation is false information spread with the intent to deceive or mislead. Misinformation is false information that does not necessarily have that intent, but still gets out into the public realm and misleads people and leads to bad decisions and leads to disruptions in society. Both of those are threats to our societies and things that our public policy leaders are concerned about. They're threats to democracy. It can definitely be a threat to human rights. And therefore, something that we are talking about today at the highest levels, and we should be looking at to do more. And that's why, in part, we're here tonight, to hear some excellent insights from these 3 great Fulbright alumni. This topic is something that I am also very concerned about as a U.S. citizen. Our intelligence agencies released a report that said unequivocally that the Russian Federation was putting out disinformation during the 2016 U.S. election. In order to preserve our democracy, we have to ensure that Disinformation does not skew election results, does not create problems and divisions in our society. And this is something that we have to work with our private sector on as well. The tech industry is a very important player. All of the internet and social media is absolutely critical in the flow of information, both for good and for bad. And so as we wrestle with these topics today, thank you for joining in, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. So it's my pleasure to moderate this panel, and I will start by introducing myself. I am a professor in information science at the University of Bergen, Department of Information Science and Media Studies, and I focus on human-computer interaction. That means that I'll do research on both the design and the implications of technology. And I've done studies in use of technology in different domains and settings. One of them is mobile journalism and visual technologies in journalism and mental health care and education. And I also had the privilege to be a Fulbright scholar at the University of California in 2019, 2020. I had to leave because of the COVID pandemic, but still it was really nice, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity. So now we have heard a general introduction to the topic here, and the topic of disinformation and human rights activism of the day. And I think, as we heard already, it's obvious that this is an important topic. And if we are going to have informed decision-making and political processes, such as around climate change, if we are to have fair election outcomes and in matters of public health as well, such as we have seen during the COVID-19 crisis, having access to reliable information is crucial. And as we will discuss today, this impacts human rights efforts. And we could claim that without trustworthy and reliable information, it's hard for democracies to function properly. And the challenges that lies, disinformation, propaganda, and fake news represent for open societies, these are not new. But with every new medium, and this happened with the printing press as well, I guess, and now we have the rise of social media. It's well established, and what we really hoped to be like a democratization of the public sphere with social media, that everyone could express themselves and contribute. I guess we have seen a flip side of that, and of course there are more opportunities we shouldn't forget the positive sides. There are more opportunities for people to express themselves, to give their opinions, to reach people through these new channels. But I think that there has been a shift in both the proportions and the nature of disinformation. So we have concepts like filter bubbles, echo chambers, and now we also see how AI is making a contribution into this with, for example, making deep fakes. We have a colleague in Gothenburg that just made a video of himself talking and posted it on YouTube, and 3 days later he came out and said, "No, this is not me. This is just a synthesized version of me." And everyone on social media had believed that it was him, but he showed that this is how it's done, and it's quite incredible. And I think there are a lot of potential here, but lots of dangers to these technologies. So so just to take a talk about disinformation in a more formal sense. So we have this like an information theoretical perspective on disinformation and what information actually is. And one proponent is Luciano Floridi at Oxford. And he says that, okay, we can define disinformation as a form of factual semantic content. So it's factual, it's not instructional, it's has meaning, it's semantic, and but it's also untrue if it's supposed to be disinformation. And as we heard, I guess like a very simple statement such as the color of this building is red. That is an example of disinformation, because I know it isn't. So it's not misinformation, as we heard. And so this deliberateness is very important to understand this concept. But then on the other hand, it's to decide whether something is true or false, it can seem pretty straightforward, and as in my example, it is. But in reality, I don't think it is so straightforward. And in information theory, it's very simple because we can just assume that the difference between disinformation and information, well, that's the matter of it's true or not. So it's not my point here to be a total relativist for that matter, but I guess that what is seen as truth and lies, or information or disinformation, might depend on your point of view, at least in politics. And on the other hand, we have journalism and science, which are two key institutions that are supposed to govern, not to own the truth, but to govern the pursuit of truth, and also to help us to uncover and generate true factual information that can be used to enlighten the public or generate new knowledge. So I think that information and disinformation in practice actually are entangled in a context or a web of language, conversations, communication, media, trust, and technology. And I think that today we will try to disentangle some of these issues and also look at how it relates to human rights advocacy. And to help us sort this out, we have an excellent panel of experts. And yes, we have Jostein Hole Kobbeltveit, and you were appointed Executive Director of the Rafto Foundation for Human Rights in 2016. And he has also a comprehensive background as a human rights advocate, including from the Norwegian Church Aid, where he served as a policy advisor and held several management positions. And he has a long track record of working with civil society groups and social movements in Africa, South America, and Asia, from advocacy towards the United Nations and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And Jostein will, as I said, help us look at the human rights efforts in this debate. And we also have Jens Kjeldsen, my colleague and professor of rhetoric and visual rhetoric at the University of Bergen here in Norway. He is the initiator and immediate past president of the organization, the Rhetoric Society of Europe, and the co-founder and longtime chief editor of the journal Rhetorica Scandinavia. He works on rhetorical audience studies and rhetorical theory, especially in relation to media and the changing of rhetorical situations and circumstances in an increasingly fragmented, complex, and mediated world, which aligns fine with what I said earlier, I think. So Jens is here today to provide us with more knowledge on how the rhetoric has been used in the pursuit of disinformation, but also, I guess, in the pursuit of informing the public. Mm-hmm. So we will start the conversation with Jostein, and he will talk about the disinformation and human rights, and also this year's Rafto Prize laureate and the importance of credible information in social advocacy. And after that, we will hear on Jens on the power of the rhetoric. But I wanted to invite Jens immediately to give, maybe he has some immediate thoughts on my little introduction here on disinformation. So.
Thank you very much, Fuda. I think you were right on target. And before I comment on that, I would like to say to the Fulbright Foundation, thank you very much for making me a Fulbright scholar and a Fulbright alumni. I've spent time at Berkeley, at Northwestern in Chicago, and it's been such a pleasure. We've had our whole family in the United States. We now have many friends. So the bonds that we heard on in the introduction, I can agree on completely. It's been a pleasure to get to know the United States and get to deal the good things and less good things about Scandinavia with the Americans. Now, I think you were right on target when you say that, when you sort of question what is information and disinformation. I think that the most important things in the world is not about information, and it's not about truth. As you say, most political decisions, they're not really about whether one thing exists or do not exist. They're about choices. And I think if you just think about disinformation as information and something that is then not information, then we will miss how people mislead us. Take, for instance, the Iraqi war. There was a lot of information there, and maybe we can talk about that later, which was not directly disinformation, but it was about whether or not one should go into Iraq or not go into Iraq. And that decision is not about information. It's based on information, but doing it or not doing it is a deliberation forth and back. So I think we should expand our thoughts. And then, before Jostein joins us, I think it's important to remember that people breaking human rights are not afraid of also breaking rules about truth and falseness. So I think that's a problem, because we can all make our own deepfakes now, but we don't do it. But some people do, and that's the problem.
Yes. Jostein, do you have any thoughts on you want to talk about disinformation and human rights?
Yes, well, first of all, so thank you to the Fulbright Foundation and the U.S. Embassy for inviting us here. I think it's a topic which is very critical and these days. And I think from the Rafto Foundation, we have been supporting human rights defenders for 135 years, and we do that in different ways. And we work with and support defenders who, many times risk their lives for telling the truth or challenging people with power. And it's not a new thing that there are efforts to stop them. But it's more that today it takes different shapes and forms. Normally, human rights defenders would have had, there have been many formal restrictions on freedom of speech. There's been censorship. There's been, government-owned newspapers who won't let them, cover their story, cover their work, or misrepresent them. But today, the challenges are a bit different, because you're in this context where you have an information overflow, where everybody has access to a lot of information, where everybody can be their own editor and can also publish a lot of information, and in all of this, which can be various degrees of quality, it also increases the flow of misinformation, and it makes it possible to also to actively promote disinformation. And I think that's a new thing, and that also makes that many authoritarian governments that we see are also on the rise often don't have to do that much themselves. They can just let this all play out, and I think that's one of the challenges we see, that it's difficult both for human rights defenders to access the public sphere, to get a platform where they can shed light on human rights violations and be heard. But they can also, but it's also disinformation can be actively used against them, often by groups that are maybe supported or just condoned by government, but that you don't have. But you don't have to have the government actively censoring them. And one of the key methods of human rights work has been to tell the truth, shed light on the truth, shed light on human rights violations. And when you're in a position where you're not able to do that, then it gets more both difficult and dangerous.
So maybe you can tell me some more about in Rafto Stiftelsen, how do you work with new media platforms and in human rights advocacy, and how do you try to exploit this platform, or how do you use them to your advantage? And
well, I think it's also, there are a lot of opportunities also in social media, and I think that human rights defenders, many places have been extremely good at using them to hold governments responsible and to and shed light on human rights violations. And we also use them. Many of the people we work with use them. So I think there are many opportunities in that, and I think that we and many others are trying to take as much advantage as possible of that. But you can also see there are these limits where you have, because of the algorithms, that you are increasingly talking to your own followers. Yeah. And I think that many are wondering, how do you, if people don't read the printed press, if they don't look at the national news on TV in the evening, as people did earlier, where can you reach the public? Where can you put things into the public domain and have a debate about it, and where you can have different truths or different opinions or interpretations of truth be at least discussed openly? And I think that's something we see more and more of a challenge of these echo chambers.
Yeah, I agree.
I wonder, so when you work with human rights now, is this a new problem? Because it seems the way you say that the breaking of human rights, working against that, would then maybe always have been to reveal disinformation or misinformation. Is that correct? So that would then mean that now you have an enormous challenge, because the tools for disinformation is so much stronger. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the sources of the misinformation are vaguer and more opaque. So you would have in many, if you looked at Eastern Europe during the Cold War, you might have authoritarian government dictatorships. They were censoring public opinion, but people knew also they were being censored, to much larger extent than what many would know today. So I think it's previously you would have had more authoritarian governments that were, they were telling their story, they were censoring media, but in a way you knew, where the story came from. Now it's much more opaque, more difficult to keep, to know where the sources are, what are the credible sources, and who can you hold accountable.
Yes, and I think it's also from another perspective, you could say that, like, if the way you're using, so of course you want to use social media, like, to get the good word out there in a way, and promote a good cause, and it might, as Jens pointed out, it might not, the important part is not if it's information or disinformation, but you have a message and you want to come through with that, And I think that who is sending this information, are they trustworthy, and you can establish a kind of trustworthiness as an institution, and I guess Rafto does that, and the people you work with, like journalism, but if we started to undermine that and provide this information about the trustworthiness of the institutions, as we have seen in many occasions over in history. We have merchants of doubt, that as a term that has been coined by Naomi Oreskes, who is a professor at Harvard, and that you have this process of constantly undermining the processes that we use to verify knowledge or to show that something is true. And I guess so they have an agenda then to do that. But in human rights, that you will have another kind of agenda. And maybe you can talk a bit to that agenda and also how you try to be transparent about the work you do.
Well, I think it's important for human rights organizations to set a good example. I think that's important, and be transparent, and be and also correct own mistakes, and be transparent about that. But I think this whole thing that you are increasingly, it's difficult to have some kind of common ground that you can discuss on the basis on. You can disagree on. You can have different interpretations. But if the very basis of the conversation is if everything is a doubt, it gets very difficult, and that leads to manipulation. The information, the public is more easily manipulated.
I think if I may, I think in a situation like the one we're in now, I think it's very important to have an institution like the Rafto Foundation, and to have good press, and even the good old-fashioned reporter, because what happens when you can't trust the text or even the images? I mean, the example you gave is an image. We see something with our own eyes, but we can't trust what we see. So then what should we do? Then you can't trust the argument. You can only trust the sender. So I think we will get a move back to more trust in institutions, certain people. I mean, that have a backside as well, but on the front of it, it would mean that we would trust Rafto Stiftelsen, we would trust the main newspapers, we would trust the main institutions. On the other hand, you would have groups of people that would also trust, but then they would trust untrustworthy people, which of course is the flip side of it. So I think when you talk about appearing as an honest, trustworthy institution, I think that's completely essential if you are to play a role in the business you're in today. And that goes for the universities as well, and for the newspapers.
And one of the challenges we see with disinformation, and when public is manipulated in many countries where we work, and we work with human rights defenders, is that also some of that disinformation can be hate speech, or it can be trying to undermine human rights defenders, their credibility, but also portray them as enemy of the people in different ways. And that by doing that, by presenting falsehood, by presenting or just mobilizing hatred against defenders or certain groups, minorities, sexual minorities, or an ethnic minority, or religious minority, you would. We also see it leads to violence. It leads to attacks on those groups. It makes the mob, take the power in their own hands, and the result is that some of those, where you might have governments previously, or authoritarian governments previously, sending in the police to jail defenders or beat people up or torture or kill, you can also you can also make sure that just happens on its own. So that's and one example of that is if you look at Myanmar, for example, with the genocide against Rohingyas. Obviously today, with the junta now firmly in charge in Myanmar again, they are using very much traditional ways of blocking communication and blocking media and so on. But the interesting thing was that when you had a relative time of democracy in Myanmar for the last 10 years, there was not that much censorship. It was actually a total lack of any kind of regulation. And there you could see what happened when you just had social media with their algorithms working on their own. And you were able to see a huge majority of the population nurturing extreme hate against a small group of Muslim Rohingyas to the extent that it legitimized killings of tens of thousands and fleeing of 600,000 Rohingyas to Bangladesh.
And I think, if I may, in that connection, I think when you mention hatred, I think that's very important because it points again to the point that we began with, namely that if we only look at disinformation, we will miss the whole picture. Because hatred is not disinformation, it's hatred. Now, it will very often be built on hatred. You would say that a certain group is so-and-so and they're not. But it's not information. And even if you have one group of people calling the other group of people cockroaches, for instance, that's also not disinformation because it's so obvious that they're not cockroaches, they are human beings, but it is a metaphor that you can't label as disinformation or misinformation, but it still leads to hatred. And very often I think it is built on a foundation, but an unseen foundation of untruth or disinformation. And we saw the same thing, by the way, during the Second World War with the Germans or the Nazis talking about the Jews. So we had the same kinds of rhetorical devices, but only a small part of it is actually disinformation or misinformation. So we have to look at it in the broad picture, I think, at least.
Yeah.
Yes, and the role of these. So now we see that we don't have the propaganda apparatus of that Hitler had. This was mass media coming into play, but now we have social media, and you have a much more organic kind of conversation going on, but still, and you have the algorithm that actually tunes in on what people hear, and everyone sees something different, and that's the power of it, and that's also the danger, I guess. It's very hard to get a full overview, but I guess in the example you mentioned, that when it grows organically, what grows can also might need to be moderated. And what is the role here? Do you think both of you, but of the social media companies, the tech giants here, we have YouTube content from Google, we have our Alphabet, and we have Facebook and Twitter, and we have TikTok and these. What kind of responsibility do these, and do we want to leave this? It's maybe a rhetorical question. Leave this responsibility into the hands of these big companies, or how can we address this?
I don't have the answer. I think that's an immensely difficult question. Because I don't know how to control these big companies. I mean, that's a very important political question, but I think part of the main problem from a rhetorical point of view is that whereas before, which you also pointed to, you would know who was talking. But now you would have people producing information, disinformation, misinformation, hatred, and in the end it will gain traction among other people that will then send it on, because that's the logic of social media. So in the end, you don't know where it comes from. So what I said before about, having integrity as Rafto Stiftelsen or a newspaper is very difficult when, in a sense, there is no sender. The information is just out there floating, and that also means that people can do with it whatever they want. So if you already feel hatred or dislike certain groups, or are moving in an echo chamber, you will interpret all that in accordance with what you already think. So that was not answering your question, but I hope it was pointing to a very difficult problem, namely that the sender seems to be obliviated in our time, which means that audiences can do whatever they want with information, and that's also comes with a danger, I think.
Yeah, and well, I think you're perfectly right, and also, it's difficult to say what the answer to this could be, if you can have more regulation of it, or if it's more to have, the editorial responsibility of these companies needs to increase, and they need to take it, and they need to be responsible for it. But it's a very challenging material, because you also, in a way, this idea that we are all out there, we are all being our own editor. We are challenging and questioning traditional institutions like big media houses, government information, so on. There is also something, that it appeals, well, we are critical. We are citizens that are questioning truths. There is something very appealing to that, and very important to that. Human rights defenders tend to be people that are questioning, truths. But today we see that kind of stamp of, or seal of, being the ones questioning the truth. That becomes something you question any truth, And while government or media houses or, can be wrong, they're probably not always wrong, And this is what you see with the whole, with all these conspiracy theories around the coronavirus or vaccine or health authorities. When there's no thing which can be right or wrong, we are on a very dangerous path.
And I also think that maybe we should start thinking about, why would people lie? Because much misinformation is basically lying. Why would they lie? Why would they promote things that are not true? And I think one important thing is, firstly, people have a mission. They want a mission in life. And secondly, they want comradeship. They want something to belong to. And if we look at QAnon, who has, dispersed a lot of disinformation and misinformation, when you actually talk to those people, they feel that they're part of a group. They're part of a community, and that makes them want to belong, and that makes them want to promote the lies, because basically it's lies that they promote. And I had a student that examined the propaganda magazine of ISIS, and you would suspect that would promote a lot of kill the infidels and a lot of lying, but mostly actually the imagery, the text was about comradeship. It was people sitting around the fire. It was together on a truck fighting for the good cause. And I think if you want to understand the dynamics that drives misinformation, I think we should look at the need for the want to have a mission and the need for comradeship. I think that's sort of the foundation for this.
So maybe you could tell us some more about the consequences in light of the recently awarded Rafto Prize and the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, and how they work.
Yeah, it's also, I guess, a sign of the times that we are this year's Rafto Prize, because the Rafto Prize normally it should shed light on human rights defenders that needs the world's attention, and you should also try to look at what human rights challenges we face looking ahead. And this year's Rafto Prize has been awarded to a group of statisticians, a small group, 5 people sitting in San Francisco, and where they are using statistics and AI to uncover and document human rights violations on a gross scale, and they are able to gather different data material from, they've used that in Guatemala, in Kosovo, in Chad, in Syria, and been able to both compile that into credible statistics and information, but also been able to hold some of the perpetrators accountable. Both in Guatemala and Chad, former heads of state has been convicted with information they have provided, and I think that's and I think for the Rafto Foundation, with the award this year, we want to say that, you know, people searching for the truth, trying to give us credible and factual analysis is something which is critical for human rights work if we're both going to have a common basis to discuss on, but also if we're able to keep perpetrators accountable. And I think one important aspect also of how Human Rights Data Analysis Group works is also that they also reveal biases in existing statistics. They use how statistics are being misused, which is also an important part of it. So it's very I think that with both the Rafto Prize to Human Rights Data Analysis Group, with the Nobel Prize to 2 journalists this year, I think it kind of shows a bit where some of the challenges ahead are, and
And I think this also falls in line with this, that the truth, it might, so it's about the institutions in a way, and about certain ways of doing, of searching for credible information and have good sources. And maybe some of them, at least I have this thought that, okay, maybe some of the problem is that we like, if you come out and very rhetorically and strongly claim something, and maybe that's beyond what you can actually prove, or that you're not humble, that you might be wrong about what you're claiming, for example, and that might be also part of the problem, not only that people try to like mislead you, but there are opposing views on a matter, and some things are that we can call facts and are in proper information, and that can lead to knowledge, and that can lead to interpretations and implications for policy and for all kinds of stuff, that when you like start to mix these things up, that's also where a problem can arise. And I guess that this kind of transparent organization, and that they are very transparent on how they work, and you have these like faktisk.no here in Norway that like checks facts for newspapers and store stories and claims from politicians. And they are also very transparent on how they work. So I think that it might be a clue to.
But I think you're onto something there also, because it is important that we are, that we can discuss things, that we can ask questions, that we can, be open about our, uncertainty on issues, and obviously there are in public debate, in public discourse, there are, many things are opinions, then there are interpretation of facts, then there are facts that might not be sure about. But if this table is black or not, or how many people there was at the presidential inauguration, those are facts that you can verify. And when there is when there's anything, there's nothing which is the truth, then you have a problem. But I think also one of the challenges we've seen with social media is that it tends to favor those who are very certain of things. It's not the place for nuances. It's not the place to just be, carefully wondering. And it really, I think anyone who's tried to put out a tweet or something on Facebook would see what happens if you put on something with a few more sentences and a bit of nuances. It doesn't go very far. So anyone who wants to get heard in this media needs to have a strong opinion, be very tabloid, and tweak the truth a little bit to get heard. And it's all of us are very tempted to use it. And I think that also does something with public debate. And when everything happens so instant, there's no, previously when you had, it took 24 hours for a newspaper to be produced and get out there, or a TV show to be produced. But now everything is happening so quickly, and things can get carried away very quickly.
I think you're right, and we know from studies of social media and online communication that especially social media runs on two things, and that's moral issues and emotionality. And we all, especially if you can appeal to outrage, that gets the biggest amount of clicks that you can imagine. So if you have a positive issue, you won't get as many likes or outrageous faces on social media. So if it's emotional and if it's moral, and if you combine those two, you have a driving force for generating clicks and likes.
Yes, and I think that you're mentioning like some of the rhetorics that are used in, for example, the tweet, or how you have to assume a certain ethos and a certainty and confidence in your. It might be overconfident, lead to that because of the rhetoric. But I guess that's we started to talk about like this is not something new. Disinformation is not something new, and propaganda and all this. And maybe you have a few comments on how this has been over the time and over the times. Jensen can say a bit more.
I think what we already talked about is that what is new is the amount of it, the speed of it, and the removement of the communicator from the communicated. I mean, but this goes back, centuries. In ancient times, the emperor Octavian, for instance, he attacked Marcus Antonius and his wife or his lover, Cleopatra. And how did he do that? He put pictures on coins, they had poems, and they did speeches. And that was also disinformation, or basically just lies. And of course, Marcus Antonius did it the same way. Octavian said that Marcus Antonius was a drunk that had taken upon him the barbaric styles of Egypt. We know from the Second World War, we know from the Iraq War, for instance. Remember Colin Powell in February 2003, basically trying to prove that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but there wasn't. And think about Bush, I think that was a little bit before in January, he said something in the lines of, and I think I should read this up because I think it's telling. Before September 11th, many in the world believed that Saddam Hussein could be contained. But chemical agents, lethal viruses, shadowy terrorist networks are not easily contained. Imagine those 19 hijackers with other weapons and other plans, this time armed by Saddam Hussein. Now, he never says in that quote, he says nothing about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but everybody thought that was what it meant. So I think that goes to a very specific rhetorical strategy, namely presuppositions. So in order to this sentence to make any sense at all, it has to be because there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But he can always say, I didn't say that. So you can't say directly that this is disinformation and misinformation, because it leaves it to you to figure out what exactly does it mean. I think that's something that we should also pay attention to.
Yeah.
But I think also that, and you're very right that all the drivers we see, they've always been there. Has always been what people use against each other, is what politicians use. It's part of the any kind of power dynamic. But also looking at the public debate around around the Iraq War was, something different than what we've seen over the last couple of years with the coronavirus or other other debates where you have the extent of the echo chambers is much higher, and the platform you discuss these things on, there's no, in those days, BBC and CNN were quite important, but now it's being discussed in these, the discussions are getting, there's very little common ground when these things are discussed, and in that sense, I think it's a difference, and it's challenging to say how are we going to get back to some kind of common ground to have these discussions on.
I think that's very important. I mean, I might be slightly a relativist, but I agree with you, the table is black. Well, it depends on the lightning, of course, but basically the table is black. And I think I'm kind of afraid if we get into a situation where we do not have that common foundation, and if a politician, for instance, will lie about anything, if anybody else will lie about anything, then that will be dissolving, human existence, basically. Imagine if you could not count on that I believed in what I said now, that I would be lying all the time, then in the end, communication would be basically impossible. Because the only reason that we listen to each other is that we think other people will say things that are true, things that they think will matter to us, that are relevant to the issue. And if you just, get rid of all those rules of human communication, then there are no society anymore.
I think one of the things that do give me some hope is that, because in addition to supporting human rights defenders and working with human rights defenders internationally, Rafto Foundation also do human rights and democracy education here in Norway with students in schools, and they do have many of them will come with a more critical sense in terms of how they see social media. They will more instantly understand that some of the things they see are not necessarily authentic. And you would see that some of those who are being mostly carried away by what they see in different Facebook groups, would often be people, from my age and above, and that. So I think that there is some hope there in that. What is considered authentic, what you believe in, is something that I think the young people now, they know more about these mechanisms in many ways. But I'm also sorry for them that they don't have some of those common places where they you would follow the same platform for debate. And how we are able to going to recreate that's, I think, the big question.
Yes, and I think that like education, to have some kind of common knowledge and values is of course important. But because you can see, like if you have a very polarization, and you can have two truths. And maybe there's very nice communication and trust within one group and then within the other. But again, there is no common ground. And how do we find that common ground? And I think one of the clues is, as we mentioned, to be more humble on some of the issues, also on what is what. But education is one trend, and I want to ask you, Jens, more about the role of we can see ourselves as rational actors here, but of course, so we have rationality and emotionality, and this whole who do you trust? So this plays an enormous role, and we discussed it on the institutional level. But maybe Anna, you can say more about this in terms of the rhetoric here, and what role it plays in relation to disinformation. And
I think that we already discussed one part of it, namely the issue of trust. I mean, if you want to persuade something, you have to first have good arguments, then you have to, move their emotions. And in rhetoric, that's not a bad thing. I mean, if you want to help people fight for human rights, then you should move their emotions so that they would say, yes, we should do that. And then you have the rational argumentation. And I think we have a tendency to think that people who believe in disinformation and misinformation, they are not logical. But actually they are. Because what they do is they take information and then place it into their own mental frameworks, and they fit it with that. And very often it is logical. The problem, of course, is that it's all based on something that's not true. But logic is different from truth or not truth, and rationality is different from truth or not truth. So, for instance, when you are in an echo chamber, you are there because you will listen to people that think and say what you already think and say. So you will strengthen what is already there, which is not necessarily irrational within the framework of what you're hearing and what you're saying. So I think that's important to remember.
And one thing you see in many elections recently has also been that there is an increasing logic that it's the politicians who are able to create most passion in their and engagement in their among their voters that will get their voters out and get so that you've seen that and that has come from different from left and right and from different sources, but you can see that those who've been able to really energize their core supporters and get them to. So it's not only about convincing most people, it's also to have people that are the most energized voters. And that logic, I think, also creates a different kind of political rhetoric, which also fits very well with what you see with the echo chambers and so on. And also insulates politicians from being, if it's being revealed that they've lied or anything, because it's, it insulates them more.
But I think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of what we know about disinformation, misinformation, social media comes from the United States. And especially when it's about politics, the American system is very different from the Scandinavian, as we know and have experienced. So when you have only two parties like you would have in the United States and in the United Kingdom or in England, you get a different rhetorical dynamics than you would get here. If you have 5, 6, 7, 8, even 9 parties, the tendency to polarization is much less to the forefront than it would be in the United States. Yes. And also what I talked about before, what we called motivated reasoning, that you're looking for reasons that fits with what you already think. That is not as easily done when you have more parties and more different points of view. So I think that's an important difference between the United States and, for instance, Norway.
And I think that's an important point. But you also see that some places in the world there are people who have been inspired by this. And I think India, which we describe as, we're often known as the biggest democracy in the world, has taken a route towards much more nationalistic populism, and where there is, you can sense that there is no aim to mobilize the entire population or reach out to the entire population. Exactly. As long as the as long as you can get parts of that population, and if that part of the population is always the majority, and I think that's something, and you've seen it also in Brazil or other places where you get these nationalistic populist leaders that it's enough to appeal to a certain group of the population, and you do that by stirring prejudice and often hate towards minorities, And that is a form of, in a way, majority rule or majority democracy, or which can be quite.
But it seems that the countries you're mentioning now are all huge countries: India, Brazil, the United States. Do you think that that has something to do with it? I mean, and the countries I mentioned were all very small countries: Denmark, Norway, Sweden.
But you could also see that in Uganda when it comes to the sexual minorities, or you can
Hungary.
So there are, or what you saw in Myanmar for that sake. But it's so appealing to feelings, appealing to the majority at the cost of minorities, and a very sort of populist rhetoric and nationalistic rhetoric is something that you can see on the rise several places, and it all plays into these, as you talked about, these the feeling of we need to belong, we need to be part of a group, we need to be part of. It's very basic human feelings we all have, but they are easily manipulated in a field where information is crowded.
Because belonging to a group, the opposite of that is the out-group, of course. And the more you can demonize the out-group, the more we can feel as a coherent group.
I think we are on our time, and I can just very quickly summarize, and then we have touched upon a lot of topics, but I think that we agree that disinformation, understood in a certain way, is a problem, and it can also impact on human rights advocacy, but that we rely on these institutions, and as the Rafto Prize and the Peace Prize has confirmed, that we need these strong institutions that seek truth and are transparent and show the way. And I think we also have touched upon that education is very important, and also to find these common arenas where we can feel as one as well. And I think that's very much in the spirit of the Fulbright and his intention with the program. So I think that's a nice note to.
Thank you.
Yeah.